So I hope all of you are ready for some deep thinking. We're watching Persona. So during the period shortly before Bergman conceived Persona, he had a kind of an illness and an episode of speechlessness. And during that episode, he had a vision. And this is Bergman writing, quote, "The two women were comparing hands. One day I found that one of them was mute, like me. The other one was voluble, officious, and caring, also like me. I didn't have the energy to write in ordinary screenplay form. I found it almost impossible to shape words and sentences." That's the end of the quote. When he was asked by a producer then what the subject of his next film would be, he said that it would be about two women in straw hats on a beach. One of them speaks and the other one is silent, and they compare hands and they mix themselves up with each other. "I see," said the producer. "It will be a really little film," Bergman said, "so it'll probably be cheap." The producer declared himself ready to back the film. The success of The Silence, which we watched last time, probably contributed to the producer's lack of caution. But nevertheless, it was a leap into the unknown, and indeed, Bergman would later say, and this is a quote from him, "With Persona, and later with Cries and Whispers, I went as far as I could. In those films, I freely touched the wordless secrets that can only be revealed by cinematography." End of quote. Bergman's original working title for this film was Cinematography. And when you're watching Persona, it's easy to become consumed by the puzzle of the relationship between the two women. Or are there really two women? And to forget that Persona is very much a film about film. But the opening sequence with the film strip running through the projector and the references to silent film and a montage of apparently disconnected images remind us that we are watching a film and that everything we see and hear is created through that medium. What is real in the film? Nothing is real, of course. There are not two women or one woman or a doctor or a boy or an island, but a succession of images running through a projector. And in case we become too enamored by the illusion of a summer on an island and the drama between the nurse and her patient, Bergman lets the film strip break and burn at a critical moment, though that, too, of course, is an illusion. When the film was made, and the first time I saw it a really long time ago, films did sometimes jam in projectors, break and burn. And so the audience watching the film with me all turned to the back of the room to see if smoke was rising from the projector. But young people who are raised on digital media will probably not make that mistake. Toward the very end of the film, Bergman and his cameraman, Sven Nykvist, appear for a brief moment, filming Liv Ullmann from an elevated dolly. But these looks at the inside of the projector and the film being filmed are themselves part of the cinematographic illusion. In this film, the ground constantly shifts under the spectator who struggles to keep his or her bearings. The title became Persona, which refers both to a form of selfhood or character and historically to the masks that were worn in classical drama. Bergman says, quote, "There is something fascinating to me about these people exchanging masks and suddenly sharing one between them," unquote. The two people who exchange masks and compare hands are Liv Ullmann, a Norwegian actress whom Bergman had scarcely met before casting her in the role of the silent Elisabeth Fogler, and Bibi Andersson, a longtime Bergman actress who plays the talkative nurse, Alma. He wanted to cast the two of them because he had seen a photograph of them in which, he said, they looked devilishly alike. Their physical similarity allowed him to merge the two women, to have them become confused about the boundary between them, and even to have Elizabeth's husband mistake Alma for his wife. The original scene Bergman imagined, in which the two women compare hands, is one place where the confusion begins. When Elizabeth, an actress who has either lost her power of speech or refuses to speak, picks up the hand of her nurse for comparison with her own. Alma chides her gently, quote, "It's bad luck to compare hands, don't you know that?" So why is it bad luck? Well, there is a folk belief about the danger of doubles, the idea that if a person meets his or her double in this life, death is imminent. Hands, which are a frequent point of focus for Bergman, are, according to one neurologist, quote, "the perfect example of mirroring structures," unquote. It might seem counterintuitive to imagine that a person would become confused about whether the hand of another person belongs to his or her own pair, but in fact this can happen and it has been shown by scientific research. Bergman's interest in hands also has to do with the sense of touch and the presence of the material world for which the film is just a shadowy reflection. We saw in the silence how the young boy placed his hand against the window of the train as he looked out, emphasizing the barrier between himself and the spectacle outside the train. In Persona, the same actor, who is now 3 years older, runs his hand over a projected image, which then becomes a space between us and the boy. We are meant to experience that barrier along with him. Another sensual experience is created in the film, in the famous orgy scene. There is no visible representation of an orgy, in case you're wondering. There's no pornographic scene here. Only a verbal account of what happened on a beach one day. Bergman wants us to identify with Elizabeth, who sits quietly listening to Alma's revealing story. Bergman writes, quote, "If you look at Leave's face, you'll see that all the time it's swelling. It's fascinating. Her lips get bigger. The story mustn't only have a suggestive effect on Elizabeth, it must have a suggestive effect on you, the viewer, enable you to experience it all deep down inside you in your own film projector," end quote. Bergman also says, "Once I said, the persona saved my life. It is no exaggeration. If I had not been able to make the film, I would have probably been ruined. It was significant that, for the first time, I didn't care if the result would reach an audience or not. The gospel that everything has to be comprehensible, that had been stuffed down my throat since the days of my servitude at the Swedish film industry as a script editor, finally was sent to hell where it belongs," end quote. Persona belongs to a place and time. It was made in 1966 on the small rocky island of Fårö, off the coast of the larger island of Gotland, which lies between Sweden and Finland. Bergman calls this, quote, "my landscape," because of the way it reflects his interior reality. The women's clothes and hairstyles, the clean lines of the beach house where they stay, all of these announce Swedish modern. And the television newscast about the war in Vietnam anchors us in a particular political moment. But at the same time, the film is timeless. It happens in a space and time separate from ordinary human experience, or perhaps in the unconscious, someone's dream. I have probably thought about this film more than any other film I've seen in my life, and still it is very difficult to know what to say. After we have watched it, I will be interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you. Okay, so since this is going to be recorded, there are microphones that will be brought around to people as they raise their hands. There are a lot of us here today. Persona is a very popular film. And so I'd ask you to keep your comments short, and each person gets one comment. Okay, that way we'll try to hold on to some ordning och reda, as the Swedes call it, order in the room. So the first thing I wanted to mention, just in terms of the subtitles, that I've always found a little bit interesting. These subtitles were actually very good. When Persona first was released in the United States, British subtitles were used, and the orgy scene especially was really completely unintelligible. Nobody could understand what the person was saying. But even with the subtitles having been fixed, there's a word in Swedish that doesn't translate very well into English. So when Nurse Alma is first given the assignment to take care of Elisabeth Fogler, she comes back to the doctor and she says, I'm not really sure that I am ready for this assignment. And then the doctor says, well, what do you mean? And she says, well, I don't think, and in English she said, I don't think I'm mentally strong enough. But in Swedish, she would use the word, she used the word själslig, which refers to the soul. So I don't think I'm spiritually strong enough. There isn't really a distinction. It's like a German and Swedish are the same this way. There's no real distinction between spiritual and mental in that way. You would use your soul. She later on says that if Lisbeth Fogler was to become, if they were to trade places, that Lisbeth Fogler's soul was too big and would start squeezing out of her body. So she uses the same word there, soul. So I just wanted to point that out. Other than that, the things that you weren't able to understand didn't have anything to do with Swedish, and so so I don't have any more helpful glosses for you on the film. So I'll allow people to make their comments and questions as they like. So I have the microphones ready if you're interested. Yeah, I have someone sitting up there in the middle up there.
A quick comment and a question.
Okay.
So what I took away was the idea of roles.
Yes.
The artist, the actress, assumes many roles, including Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
And the nurse is stuck in one role. She's supposed to be helping, but she can't.
Yeah.
So how was the film interpreted at the time of its release?
Oh, okay. Well, okay, so there are a couple things you said. One about the roles. So as some of you have been coming to the series regularly and you will have heard many times, then the Bergman is interested in the way that people perform, not only in the theater. He's very, very interested in theater because a big part of his life was also in the theater. He was a theater director, but also in their daily lives. And he's very interested in how in our daily lives we are always performing. And the question is whether there is any true real self underneath the performances. So it's interesting that you draw this comparison between Lisbeth Fogler, who's an actress and therefore shifts roles constantly, and Alma, who has kind of fixed for herself, probably. She seems to almost to have assigned herself this role. And we see Alma at the very beginning of the film set up in bed. She can't sleep. She's just been assigned the task of taking care of this very mysterious and slightly frightening woman. And she sits up and she turns on the light and she starts moisturizing. This is how she calms herself, apparently. And then she starts saying who she is. Like, I'm Alma, I have my fiance, we're going to get married. All of that has been decided, right? So Alma's role in life, as you note, has been scripted, and apparently it's been scripted by Alma, but she also says that's inside of me. That is inside of me, that I'm going to have a couple kids, blah, blah. Later on in the film, she has this other idea where that she has this fantasy of getting to be an elderly nurse and going to live with the nurses in the nurse's home, right? So that's another potential role, but maybe that comes after the mother role. But you're right. She and it's important to Alma. Apparently, it's a comfort to Alma. She says that feels secure, right? She says that. I think that's what she says in English, right? That feels safe to me. That feels secure, and so having a role makes us feel secure. We know what our role is. We know what our lines are. We know how we're supposed to behave in life, and that's a feeling of comfort. And Elizabeth Fogler has the opposite situation where she's always changing roles, and that seems to have put her into a kind of a tailspin of some kind. We don't know exactly what happened to her, but she loses it while she's standing on stage. But what then happens, of course, is that Alma loses her footing. And she isn't the person that she thought she was, and she becomes unsure and insecure. So this whole issue of playing roles is a way of coping, but if your role becomes upset, then it can set you into a tailspin. Now, one thing that I want to bring up here is that Bergman uses this almost exactly the same lines in a later film. If you watch Fanny and Alexander, he has a character who is an actress, who's kind of reminiscent of Liv Ullmann, a young actress, and she marries a bishop. And the bishop in this film is a villain. Bergman doesn't often have people in his films who are like unmistakably 100% villainous. The bishop really is. Okay, he is a villain. He's a horrible person. Yes, thank you. And he has a dialogue exchange with his wife in which he says, you know, you've always said that you are able to change roles without blinking and that you can constantly go back and forth between roles. I have only one role, and it has been branded into my flesh. Only one mask, he says, has been branded into my flesh. So Bergman is very, very interested in this whole question of role play, performance, and how that maps onto our regular lives. Now, how the film was received when it first premiered. People didn't really know what to make of it, which is probably how people still feel about the film. I mean, people have a lot of things to make of it, you know, that people can make all kinds of things of it, but it doesn't really necessarily feel like there's one possible thing to make of it. One of the things that's kind of interesting between the change that has occurred between our situation today and the situation in 1967 when it premiered in the United States, is that at that time, if you wanted to watch Persona, you had to go to a theater. You couldn't have a DVD or have it streaming into your house, and you couldn't stop it and try to and rewind it and watch it again and try to figure what happened. Okay, so one of the things that's really interesting is that one of my favorite essays ever that was written about Persona was written by Susan Sontag. And she watched the film when it first came out in 1967. But she really only had access to going to the movie theater to watch it. So she watched it, and I think she may have watched it more than once, I don't know. But she didn't have the advantage of being able to stop it. So she makes mistakes. Okay, so when I say mistakes, I mean she remembers things that actually weren't there. Okay, so to give you an example, she says, and the husband of Lisbeth Fogler is blind. Okay, I understand why she would remember that. You know, maybe she only saw the film once, or maybe she saw it twice. And after I read her essay, I thought, is he? And I went back. I was like, I don't think he is. He takes off his glasses and he's looking. You know, he's wearing dark glasses as a blind person might. But he's not blind. She thinks he's blind because he doesn't recognize his own, that, you know, this woman he's talking to is not his wife. But that's what's interesting about that scene. That for some reason, and there are lots of different ways to read that scene too. You know, it's like, and the way I have read it sometimes is that Lisbeth Fogler is the director and Alma is playing her with her husband, and the way he's talking, it almost sounds like they're saying lines, you know. And she takes Alma's hand and says, "Now you should caress his face," you know, that whole thing. But it's a really creepy play, and then it ends up with them in bed together. So, but in any case, and the whole thing was probably a dream, anyway. Okay, so you can see the problem for someone who goes to the theater in 1967 and sees it once or sees it twice and then tries to sit down and write an essay, right? Yeah, no, it's very hard. It's very hard. So, you know, to answer your question, people didn't quite know what to make of it, but sometimes their readings of it are very interesting because they didn't have the same access to it that we have now. Yeah, I have someone here. I have someone there. I have someone there. Varsågod.
I think what you just said was very illuminating, actually, because I always find at the beginning of watching any film, especially a Bergman film, is the sense of how does he get these actors to do these things? How does he create this character? And when you're doing that day in, day out, you know, it becomes, you know, it's like, you know, if you're a musician going and playing this piece of music, and then the next night you have to play a different piece of music, and you have to identify with each one, with each, and so there's this battle that's going on with us as viewers. Do we take it literally, or do we see it like you say? Do we see it as Bergman saying, well, this is really what we do every single day? The actors have to inhabit another persona, including but you have this dichotomy between Liv Ullmann and Bibi, where Bibi is a total novice at it, or playing the novice.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So Bergman and his actors, that's a whole another chapter. And how do you, so what Bergman is actually, what he seems to be requiring of the actors in this particular film and in some of the other films as well is to acting, you know, to what is acting, and to how do you show an audience when someone is acting and when they are not acting, and what does it mean to be yourself, and is there ever any kind of situation in which you are truly someone without acting? So sometimes I think in his films you can see, like I just said, the scene that plays out is almost as if I could feel that Gunnar Bjornstrand, that's the husband, he plays the husband, I can feel that he's supposed to be acting in that scene, but I'm watching a film, they're all acting. There's a baseline of acting, right? So how do you then produce, I'm acting now? And obviously if you were doing sort of very melodramatic acting, you know, it would be obvious, but it's not. It's realist acting. I mean, it's interesting to watch. Okay, so I'm going to do something shameless. I wrote a book about film authorship, and I write about the directors and their actors. And I'm very interested in how Bergman interfaces with his actors. So there's a small piece of that in that book, and they have that book here at the bookstore. That's the shameless part. I don't usually do that. I don't usually plug my book, partially because you almost can't find it anywhere. But it is there. But I do think a lot about this because there's some kind of interesting interpersonal thing that happens in the act of direction, in which you're taking a human being and you're saying, okay, this is what I want you to be. This is what I want you to feel and show, and you are going to communicate this thing that I'm thinking about. You're going to communicate this for me. So that person sort of stands in for the director's thoughts and the director's ideas and the director's visions and the director's story, and plays them out for the director. Now, and the viewer also, of course. Now, obviously, every actor is a human being, and he or she inserts something that the director would not be able to anticipate into what happens, because they're all individual human beings. But there's this weird kind of projection onto these other human beings to make them be something for you that I think is a very interesting part of directorship. And I think that in Persona that he tries to show you what that looks like when in that scene. And it's really creepy. That's what's interesting about it, is it looks like a form of vampirism or parasitism, or it's not nice. Let's put it that way. So what's happening when you take over another person's body and make it do what you want it to do? That's a kind of a directorial thing right there. Okay, so I have people there. I had someone down here, I think. Then Fanny and Alexander, I'll just say while they're passing the microphone around, he actually directs a boy who's playing Bergman as a child. So he's talking to this boy. This is a scene from his childhood, and he says to the boy, "Okay, now you feel sick." And I'm thinking, how does the boy? I mean, I guess he can try to look sick, right? So, but it's like, you want your mother, and you feel sick, and I'm going, okay. He's like, so he's creating a whole inner life for the person, so that person will try to project that inner feeling. Okay, who has the microphone?
So I had a question about.
Who has the microphone? Can you raise your hand? Yeah. Who has it? Thank you. Okay.
I was looking very specifically at the moment where Alma grabs the pot of boiling water, and there's the whip pan that's over to Liv Ullmann.
Yeah.
And I was trying to determine whether or not it was Liv Ullmann's voice that cried out, or whether it was B.B. Anderson's voice that cried out. And I have not been able to figure that out. And I wonder if you actually knew one way or the other.
I don't know factually. I've also looked at that scene a number of times. Logically speaking, it should be Liv Ullmann's line, because she says, "Stop it, no, please," she says. And I don't think it's her voice, though, because one thing about this is that Liv Ullmann, as I mentioned very briefly in my introduction, is a Norwegian, and she speaks Swedish in Bergman's films, but it's almost always discernibly her, you know. Even when she does have a line that is her line, which is ingenting, which means nothing. Nothing is her one word, the one word that she says that we know she said. It makes sense that it would be her line, but it sounds like Bibi Andersson's voice to me. And it sounds like a Swede speaking. It doesn't sound like a Norwegian. So that, I agree with you, that's confusing. And it's sort of almost like Bibi Andersson is telling herself. Because she's a nurse. What is she doing? She's getting ready to throw boiling water on her patient. That's really not in the rule book. And she does feel very conflicted. She, at certain points, she knows, it's like, oh my God, I'm supposed to be taking care of this person, and I just made her step on a piece of glass, you know. So those are the moments where you feel the tear, the fissure in her most strongly, because it's like the role that she had assigned to herself to take care of people. Now she's like the nurse from hell, and she's gonna throw boiling water. So I think there could be this moment of tearing in her, so it could be her voice. But that's a good observation. Yeah, I've asked myself that question too. Yeah. Does somebody else have a microphone?
I got the impression at some point in this film that Alma was, I don't know how to say it exactly, channeling Elizabeth Vogler, that you could say that Elizabeth Vogler's soul had come into Alma the way Alma was afraid it was. But something that you were saying is how does a director move his actors? But it seems to me that Elizabeth Vogler was moving Alma, all the things she wouldn't say or couldn't say, Alma started to say.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's okay. So there are times when Bibi Andersson's face changes. I mean, and she looks like a different person. This is towards the end of the film, right? But there are also these moments, and I think you might be alluding to one of them, the very strange sequence where Alma tells the story of how Elizabeth Vogler had her child, which we get to hear twice. It's like, oh no, are we going to have to listen to this terrible story again? Yes, word for word, because basically I filmed it, from two different angles, and then you see one person and then you see the other person. But there are moments when she's channeling Elizabeth Vogler in ways that are not possible in the human world, right? It's not possible for me to know what your thoughts, secret thoughts and feelings about childbirth were when I didn't even know you, and so. But at the same time, the story that she's telling Elizabeth Vogler seems to agree that this is true. If you see the reaction shots, right, she's like, you can tell that she's sort of upset, not because she's disagreeing, but because she feels like it just hit home in some way, right? Okay, so in that sense, and that kind of channeling, and Bergman's really interested in that kind of channeling too. in other films that we've watched earlier, he has these odd scenes that I call mirror scenes, where he'll have one character tell another character who they are or what they are. You know, you are an egotist. You are, and this is one of those. Well, and you would say, oh, there's no mirror. Well, there is a mirror. The two women are sitting across from each other, and they mirror each other, right? So that's the mirror in this particular mirror scene. But it's not possible, as I said, in the realistic world for us to tell each other our thoughts. I suppose I don't know. Maybe as a mother, I can tell my son what he's thinking. But not really. And so Bergman creates this situation in which people kind of mind meld, or they have access to each other's ideas or thoughts and are able to tell each other things. And that's one way of thinking about channeling. This happens also very vividly in Fanny and Alexander. So he repeats this kind of motif of people channeling other people. Yeah. I have someone here and here. Is there a microphone down here also? I can't tell where they are. It's like
I guess I have this. Yeah. Since it's such a total mystery, I was trying to pay attention to scenes where he did something sort of absurd or something really surprising on this. And yes, it was sort of the whole film, but the ones that didn't fit in at all, I thought. And maybe he was trying to say something in those on the assumption that he's the kind of filmmaker who wouldn't just throw things in just to be absurd, but be there for some kind of reason to his head. So one was that double repetition of the story that you just talked about. So I was going to talk about that. But so since that's been mentioned, let me just mention one other one. It was a film clip. I'm not sure what it was, but it was of kids inserted. And was it a Holocaust scene? I'm not sure. There was some kind of a film clip of little kids.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and if so, what was that doing there?
Okay.
And you know, it's easy to interpret like, well, again, the big question of the silence that everybody's written about since the Second World War was, how can you have language? How can you not be silent after an episode of such evil?
Yes.
And was he trying to relate to that? And if so, was like one of the themes. Yeah, I'm talking about role playing, of course. I'm talking about who we are as people. I'm talking about who's the author and who's the listener, and all this stuff that the whole modernist tradition was concerned with. But then, hey, here's some reality out there.
Okay, let me comment on the clip that you want me to comment on. Okay, so I mentioned in the introduction that the original title of this film was Cinematography, right? And so the film is a film about film and what film can do. That's one of the things it's about. And one of the things Bergman is very interested in as a filmmaker is the silent film tradition. So that little sequence that you're talking about, where I don't think it's little kids, but it's people sort of dressed up in costumes, like performers of some kind, and they're sort of appearing and disappearing and jumping into this box and appearing again and running around. That's what you're talking about, right? That's sort of taken from the silent film tradition, where filmmakers suddenly realized that with using photography and using editing, they could create cuts and splice together so that they could make people suddenly appear and disappear, right? And suddenly you could do magic, the kind of magic that you would have to have an apparatus for, on the stage. You could do magic with film. And the Lumiere brothers are probably, from France, are probably the most famous early practitioners of this. And Bergman was really interested in their films. And you have another allusion to early film with the animation of the woman, washing herself. She's sort of the portly woman at the very opening of the film. She's sort of splashing water on herself, and then it jams in the projector, right? So Bergman is really interested in how film animates still images as a kind of a magical practice, but also it alludes to something deeper than that, It alludes to bringing dead things to life. Okay, so when you have this image that suddenly can start to move, that's what film can do for us. Things appear and disappear. But it also has the power to bring a dead person back, right? And you see this in Wild Strawberries, like when the coffin opens and this guy's reaching out, and suddenly you also see it in Wild Strawberries, this woman suddenly comes to life and starts laughing hysterically. You see it in the opening of this. We didn't touch this part yet. Okay, the opening sequences of Persona, where are we? Are we in a mortuary? You can hear like drip, drip. It's creepy. You can hear like drip, drip, and then you can hear like nurse-like feet walking through the building, and then you hear like people with carts. So you're like, okay, I'm somewhere in a mortuary. It looks like these people are dead. They're lying on these biers, and then the telephone rings, and this woman's eyes go ding. Now, what he did with that eye opening, of course, what you probably realize is that is not a natural film sequence where you show a person's eye open. It's a jump cut. It's what we call a jump cut, where you have, and this is how magic is accomplished in film, where you cut out all the intermediate stages of the eye opening. And so you just go from completely closed to completely open, and it feels you immediately as a film viewer you go, what? Because that wasn't right. That's not a naturalistic eye opening. And he does this in conjunction with them lying in the morgue. So it's almost like a dead person. The phone rang and the dead person woke up, right? And then there's the boy. We haven't talked about him yet either. A favorite feature of Persona. Some people say it's all the boy's dream. Yeah, it's like, okay, that would be an interpretation. But because he's there, maybe. But he too is lying on this beer type thing as if he were in a morgue, kind of, and and then he wakes up, And Bergman also does a lot of really weird things with extra diegetic and diegetic sound. I mentioned these categories before, but basically, this film score was composed by Lars Johan Werle, who is a fantastic modernist Swedish composer, and so there's a lot of extra diegetic that is composed music that comes in on the soundtrack, along with the sounds that come in on the soundtrack. So the telephone ringing, I think we would all say, that's diegetic sound. There's probably a telephone somewhere in that morgue that started ringing, right? That's kind of how we would interpret it as viewers, I think. But then there's this music that goes, and that should be extra diegetic, except that he reacts to it. He looks around like, where's the music coming from? It's like, that's extra diegetic, kid. It's not coming from anywhere. It's not your world. Don't pay attention to it. No, but he hears it, right? So Bergman does a lot, and he does the same thing when you have the descent of the dolly, and you hear this bonk, bonk, and then it's like there's a bus outside. So is that the bus horn diegetic, or is it the camera dolly? And is the camera dolly diegetic or extra diegetic? Because it's actually the scene of the filmmaking. He's really mixing it up. And so when I mentioned in the opening remarks that this film was originally called cinematography, this little sequence that you're alluding to belongs to that part of the film that refers us back to the fact that, hey, this is a film. Films can do really bizarre things, and that's what I'm doing here. Yeah. So, yeah, I have someone here. I have two people here. I have this person and this person, and that person there. Okay.
I don't know if Bergman was connected to this, a couple of short films that Liv Ullmann did. One called The Stronger, which is a play by Strindberg,
yes,
in which she plays both roles.
I'm sorry, who plays both? Liv Ullmann?
Liv Ullmann plays
I didn't
both
know
roles.
about that.
The silent woman who never has a word and is very plain looking, and the extravagantly glamorous woman who speaks nonstop.
Yeah.
And it just sort of like a short sense of
I don't know
things.
whether he made that film, but I do know that I actually had my students read The Stronger this week before they saw this film. Because I do think very much that the Bergman. Okay, so there's a very short play by Strindberg. You can find it on the internet. It's called The Stronger. It's only like 4 pages long, and it's about 2 women who encounter each other in a cafe, and one of them speaks and the other one says nothing. And the question then arises: who of these 2 women is stronger? And so a lot of these, I mean, what we see in this film is a very, very intense struggle that sometimes escalates into violence between these 2 women, and the exertion of power that the silent woman has over the talking woman is a kind of it's an interesting kind of. I think there's a really interesting moment in the film where Alma is begging Lisbeth for forgiveness, and there's a long take where she's running after her. It really bothers me because it looks like she's barefoot and it's really rocky there. But anyway, she's running after her. Please forgive me. And then she, as Bergman's characters almost always do, she turns on a dime and she said, "You made me talk to you. You wanted to hear about my life." And you're like, wait a minute. I don't remember her asking to hear about your life. Okay. She did not. But what's so interesting about silence is that we project onto it. The person's not saying anything, and so we're like sitting there, what, and Alma decides that it was clear as day that she was supposed to tell Lisbeth all about her life and the secrets she never told anybody else, and so that's one of the things that silence can do for you. And Strindberg is really interested in that. August Strindberg, who was Bergman's, I don't know how to describe it. But one of Bergman's most important sources is August Strindberg, and so Bergman picks up this same dynamic of what does it mean to exercise power over someone by not saying anything, right? Okay. I have 2 people down here who've been waiting.
Can I just ask, it's another short film that Liv Ullmann made called An Actor Works, in which she acts out like the Greek tragedies, etc.
Yeah.
And when I saw bits of Greek tragedy in this, is that what you see when you see that, the grotesque?
The mask, you mean? Oh, okay. He's obviously referring to Greek tragedy in this action between the 2 women, in part, right? Although Greek tragedies don't usually just involve 2 women. but the kind of conflict that's staged there, he's obviously referring to that. And then he refers very explicitly to, I think it's to Medea. Is it Medea that she's acting? Electra, sorry. It's Electra that so he refers explicitly to Electra. He also has this, towards the very end of the film, he has this very interesting statue that's in the garden that looks like a mask also. So there are strong references to classical drama and the way in which this kind of drama is relevant or still important to cultural life today. So yeah, this is a very modern setting, but the classical drama is still current in the people's lives. I have 2 people down here that I have to let speak because they've been waiting, and the microphone just keeps gravitating higher and higher. So I need to have the microphone brought down here for a second, and then we'll go back up. Do we have just one microphone this time? There's one down here? Okay. So go ahead.
So I guess I did project on Liv Ullmann and her choice to be silent some kind of great wisdom and great spiritual connection with herself. And so because I projected in that way, when the whole thing with the unsealed envelope happens and it's discovered, it's like I think I may have gotten more outraged than even Alma because it just broke into half what I had put on Liv Ullmann. So I don't really understand how she could have written what she wrote in that letter.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So we as viewers, because we're represented this person who doesn't speak, and we don't know why she doesn't speak, we are offered this opportunity to project onto her. And the letter is this very, very interesting moment where I said before that she only has one word, which is nothing. But she actually has a lot of words in the letter. And the other issue about the letter that you mentioned in your comment is that it's not sealed. And then people are like, was it intentionally not sealed? Did she want Alma to read this? Did she mean to reveal herself? That's a question maybe for psychologists. But I think that Alma is so tempted, and rather than uphold the sort of ideal that Alma has created for herself, she goes for the temptation to find out what's behind the mask, right? She can't resist the temptation to see whether she can find out what's inside there.
But did it fit for you that Liv Ullmann had this other side that was so? It was like a 180-degree turn.
It did.
The whole movie changed after that.
It actually does for me, because I think that she's lying when she says that she didn't go into Alma's room the night before. I don't trust her character, but that's me projecting. Can you pass it down a couple rows, and then we'll go back up after this lady speaks.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. One is all of this scripted? So all those long, it's basically a huge long monologue.
Oh, the orgy monologue?
Oh, all of it, actually.
All of it.
But yeah.
Alma. She gets the whole thing almost. It is scripted, although what I read about it is that Bergman scripts things. He's a writer, and he does script everything. He's not one of these directors who says, "Okay, here's the situation. You're finding out that this is really your mother. Go." No, he doesn't know. He does not do that. It's all very, very, and it's also the Swedish that's used in Bergman's films is known among Swedes as being very formal and very sort of poetic and sometimes very old-fashioned. They make fun sometimes of his lines. I should say, though, about the orgy scene that Bibi Andersson, Bergman gave Bibi Andersson the scene to read, to memorize, and she read it, and she went back to him, and he thought that she was going to say, "I'm not going to do this," right? And she said, Ingmar, a woman would never say it like this. Let me say it. I'll say it the way a woman would say it. So the orgy scene was supposedly rewritten by Bibi Andersson because she didn't buy his version of how a woman would have experienced the orgy scene. Okay.
And then the other quick follow-up, different question is, how careful is he in selecting names for people? Like, is there symbolism in the name Alma?
He's very careful. His names are often repeated from film to film, too. So the name Fogler that Lisbeth Fogler has, that's one of his favorite names, and lots of characters in different films have them. Alma, I think maybe you're thinking about the fact that her name means soul. It is a Swedish name. Women are named Alma in Sweden, so it's not like, it's not like he would name someone in the film Soul in English, right? No, she has a name that would be a common name, but it does happen to mean that. He uses the name Anna, he uses the name Karin, he uses the name Vergerus, which is not a common Swedish name. He uses his name, what's the name? He uses Egerman, he uses that name a lot. And when somebody asked him about that, they said, "Why do you keep using the same names for these people? And what are you doing here?" And he goes, "Well, they're all related to each other." Yeah, that's him being cute. He's like him throwing meat to the hungry masses. But really, if you do look at it, you see that they are related to each other. So you have the magician Fogler in The Magician, and you have this Fogler, and there's going to be more Foglers. So Yeah. Oh, and the Hour of the Wolf, there will be Foglers. So you'll see that they're kind of related to each other. Yeah. So I think I have another. What time is it? I maybe can take 2 more, and then I have to stop. No, I have somebody up there now. Somebody up there.
Is the microphone on? Okay.
Pardon? Is it on?
I just was wondering. Well, in all of Bergman's movies, he always uses a vernacular. And some of them it's a myth, like in The Virgin Spring, and then in Winter's Light, he uses religion and the language of religion, or the language of the time that we can all understand. And this, I think it's the most compelling. He just really wants to reach out through film to reach us. A friend of mine, he was Sartre's assistant in France, came to America and was trying to teach French to American kids at the university I was at in the 60s. And he realized there was nothing he could do to reach them. So little by little, as he's walking around the room lecturing, he took all of his clothes off. And everyone just looked down.
Yeah.
Next day, he was not teaching in the French department.
No.
But he got a job in the philosophy department, which is what he wanted. No, but this is I mean, I see in this movie, I see Bergman's
taking off his clothes.
Desperation to try to reach the audience, reach not only the audience, but himself. I mean, I think it's a real exploration into, like what it is to be human. And to reach the other is how you find yourself also.
Thank you. That was the comment that I quoted in the introduction, where he says, I put aside, when I was, so Bergman, when he first started out in films, his role was to be like a copy editor for scripts. So he sat and read other people's scripts and copy edited them, but also would fix them so they would make more sense and this kind of thing. And the big rule that he was taught, was, okay, this script has to make sense and people have to understand it. So the most important thing is that it should be understandable, it should be comprehensible. And that's how he learned, to make film scripts. And so then when he himself started to make his own film scripts, he also really went toward, let's make things very clear. People should understand what's going on. And then at a certain point in his career, we can see him sort of in Smiles of a Summer Night. He's still making a kind of a genre comedy. It still follows very much the rules of French bedroom farce in a lot of ways. And as his career goes on and he has some success, he starts to slowly shed his clothes, as that was the metaphor that you were using. He slowly starts to get rid of the generic constraints, like he's not going to make genre films anymore, he's not going to make comedies, he's not going to make tragedies, he's not going to make melodramas. And then to go further, he stops trying to make people understand him. But, and this is what your comment is getting at, rather than construct a plot or a story that people are going to be able to follow, where they themselves might be able to determine the outcome, like this is what should probably happen, rather than do that kind of thing, he's going to see if he can communicate as viscerally with you as he can. That is, to bypass the story. Story is not going to be as important. And instead, I'm going to try to communicate with you. And there will be words. The words stop making sense at a certain point in this film. She actually develops aphasia at one point in the film. But then there are also going to be images that are just going to go boom, So one of them, for example, is the hand being nailed to the cross, right, at the opening. And I mean, what's kind of interesting to me about that is that he's shown us crucifixes before in his films. We've seen Jesus on the cross in Bergman's films. We've seen even a close-up of the hand nailed to the cross before. But as you were saying, it's part of the vernacular. It's part of the church. It's part of the religious practice. We see it in its nice, tidy framework. And when we see it within that framework, it's not really shocking to us because we've seen it so many times. So even though it's pretty shocking to nail someone's hand to a cross, we don't really see it. We're looking at it through this lens of, 2,000 years of Christianity or whatever. So then instead what he does in Persona, he says, you know what, I'm going to remove the Holds Church bit, and I'm going to remove the crucifix. I'm just going to have somebody's hand nailed to a piece of wood. That'll get them, And it's like, oh yeah, oh my God, that is really awful, And the same thing is true with a sacrifice. He does an animal sacrifice in that section. And if we frame it as animal sacrifice, then maybe it's still kind of horrible, but we have a framework for it, and we have some distance to it, and we have a ritual practice attached to it. But if you just have like a person holding on to an animal and cutting them up while they're alive, then you see how actually horrible it is, right? So he does that with the vampire scene. I call it the vampire scene. He does that with the vampire scene here. He does that with when she steps on that piece of glass, and we're just sort of waiting. We're waiting, and she waits, I mean, you sit there waiting with her, and you can feel the cruelty of that situation. It's just not like I broke some glass and I left it out there and I forgot. No, she's waiting for her to step on it. Yeah. And then when she finally does, we're all like, ah! So he's trying, and then with the orgy scene, need I say more? He's going for you. He's coming for you. He wants your erotic arousal, right? And he's like going to do it with language. And so he removes it from its normal film practice. The normal film practice would be to show you bodies, right? He removes that, instead does it a different way and makes you focus differently. And then you're just like, oh, wow, what did she just say? And, so you're sitting there with Liv Ullmann really listening. So I think you're right. I think absolutely you're right that in Persona, he really takes things outside the framework where we're accustomed to watch a film and see a story and see things, see images, and decontextualizes them and mixes them up in a way so that the idea is that he's supposed to penetrate your consciousness, and not just your consciousness, but your feelings, how you're feeling in the film, which I think he does fairly successfully. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop there. Obviously, one could talk for days and days about Persona, and tomorrow I'm going to talk about it again, twice. But I hope that you took away something from the film this time. And you, unlike Susan Sontag, can always go home and watch it again.